Friday in the month. We're going to do a special topic session, and today we're going to talk about the Volunteers for Salesforce app, and specifically some changes that have come to volunteers very recently, or are about to come to most people. So I'm delighted to have Cori O'Brien here and Trish Perkins, because they're two people who know more about the Volunteers for Salesforce app than probably anybody else. And I can't, and I'm afraid, Cori, what I usually say at this point is that we're all volunteers and none of us work for Salesforce.org, but we know that you're volunteering your time within working for Salesforce.org, and we're delighted to have you on the session. So, as I say,
no problem.
So on these topic sessions, so as I say, the topic today is the Volunteers for Salesforce, the Volunteers for Salesforce app. So we'll take questions on that. We're also, I think, going to tell you a little bit about some of the changes that have happened recently. And as I say, if you have a question, please put it in chat first. And as I was saying to the others as we were joining the call, I've had a rather crazy day, so I apologize for the lack of the usual, there isn't the usual slide, but Trish and Cori have both decided to put their cameras on, which is even better, so you can just see them, you don't need to see a photograph. Well, let's talk a little bit about, yay faces, somebody's saying you're getting approval. And I hope, Melissa, that the audio is just you. Can everybody else still hear me? Okay, all right. Okay, good. And Ryan says he can hear too. Thank you for that confirmation, Ryan. So, yeah, and hi, Rebecca, we can hear, good. I'm glad you can hear us too. So yes, I thought we've done a few sessions on Volunteers for Salesforce before, but I think, what's kind of up on everybody's mind at the moment is just some of the changes that have been forced to make. Oh, and I'm really glad that Art is here too. He's the product manager at Salesforce.org for Volunteers for Salesforce. Thank you for joining us, Art. I'm sure he can take questions too. So, I mean, it's interesting, isn't it? Because Volunteers has always had this really clever trick in it, the Volunteers for Salesforce app, hasn't it? To be able to leverage Salesforce sites so that you can put jobs out or publish a calendar or whatever to your website and have people sign up. And I mean, it's one of these rather clever tricks of Salesforce and leveraging some functionality in quite a clever way. And this thing that they call the guest user account, isn't it, which is takes a bit of special configuration. But I guess, well, I suppose one way to put it is that some changes to Salesforce have meant that whole using that guest user account has just got a bit more difficult, hasn't it? And I wonder, Cori, if you could, for people who aren't quite up to speed, can you just summarize very quickly kind of what the changes are, and then maybe we'll show people what sort of things they need to look for?
Yeah, absolutely. So from my understanding, the site guest user profile, that cool little trick fix, is being used by other ISV partners. We are using it in V4S. And I'm not sure that anyone really knew how many partners were using it until now, based on
trying to make a change.
Yeah, based on what you can read in the Trailblazer community, a lot of people have been caught sort of blindsided by this. We knew it was coming last summer because we are really, really careful to make sure that we're reading release notes from Salesforce Core. And trying to stay on top of it as much as we can to make sure that our packages are accommodating for any changes that Salesforce Core are making. For what I mean when I say because we're all part of Salesforce now. Salesforce.org is a very separate entity than Salesforce.com even still. And so we refer to them as core, so like your core platform, rather than the packages that we create at .org. So just to put that out there. So the changes that are coming, really what they're doing is they're saying, hey, site guest user profile, which is the user, quote unquote, that actually is the one that does the integration between any website or form or something that you've connected to the site and brings that data or communicates that data into your org. It's called a site guest user. And the change that they announced was that the org-wide defaults, the sharing settings, would be private, or private for everyone, regardless of any other settings that you have. So it really said, okay, well, if you're sharing data, if you're allowing this user to create data, regardless of what you've got going on, we're locking it down, we're making it private. And to open access, if you need to, you can create sharing rules so that you can control what you want to have shared.
So I suppose
so that's sort of,
yeah, the problem for Volunteers for Salesforce, isn't it? First of all, there's that problem of that it was being used to put information out onto the websites, isn't it? So the actual information about the shifts and things has become private. But the other problem, of course, is that what we'd all relied on was that if somebody signed up for a job, then the guest site user would be able to do a certain amount of kind of matching, wouldn't it, to see whether that contact already existed before it created a brand new one.
Right. So it has to look for and be able to see and find contact records of campaign, job information, hours, shifts. So all of these objects are now set to private for the site guest user, meaning it can't see anything, let alone edit the records or create the records. So yeah, it's a pretty big change, but it's all for the sake of security. And it's a really, really good change. It's not a change that's been made flippantly. You know, in this sort of world of, you know, hacks we hear about constantly in the news, it's definitely, I think, something that's good. It just is taking a little bit of adminning magic to get it working again.
So I suppose the first part of it is that you at salesforce.org did a bit of magicking into the app, didn't you, to make sure that once the sharing rules were set up by the admins, that actually the app would continue to work.
Yeah, exactly. And I'm just, I've got some of the art stuff up here on the hub because he's done a really good post that explains everything and like what you need to do. But essentially, we put out a version of Volunteers for Salesforce last September with changes that will allow our package to communicate in the same way using the site guest user that we were used to. So we put a hub post out in September, we added it to the release notes, updated our documentation. So hopefully all new customers using Volunteers for Salesforce as of September are already good to go. The main problems that we've been seeing, or the challenges that we've been seeing for some of our customers, is when you are an existing V4S user and now all of a sudden you've got to go in and make changes in your org. But yeah, so we added a field on the guest, it's called the custom settings, and there's a field there that allows the Volunteers app to do more than just read those objects that we need it to read. The site guest user needs to read your jobs, your contacts, or accounts, depending on your org-wide settings, etc. So we made some changes. We updated our docs and put all that out there, and have been trying to remind people since then to, you know, opt in to the Salesforce change, configure volunteers, and then test, and then you should be good. And so we've had some customers starting early last fall, most January, February. Yeah.
Great, that's excellent. Thank you for the introduction. So I don't know the people who are on the call. We haven't had any specific questions yet, but I'm wondering, folks who are on the call, we have got an example of the sorts of sharing rules that need to be created, or what you need to look for in settings, and we could talk through the changes that you need to make. Would that be helpful for folks? Or do people have... Oh, thank you. And 300 of you have already done it, so that's great.
Yeah.
So shall we do a quick work through? We're getting a yes, yes, please show us.
Yeah, I'll show.
Okay. Well, or I can show if you want to talk me through. Cori,
Sure.
I'm logged in. And
Oh, perfect.
also, please, everybody should be aware that there, and you'll have seen this, I think, in the messages that you've been sent. Is there is a new section in the Volunteers for Salesforce documentation. It's been very nicely documented, the changes that you needed to make. So
I'll put that in the chat.
please do. Thank you. And it's great that V4S is all HTML now, and you can find it on a web page, isn't it? Because it's much easier now to. Yes.
So nice.
Great.
Yes.
So great.
Our doc writer Katie put a ton of time, an incredible amount of time, to convert from PDF to HTML, and it's just the most amazing thing.
All right, so we'll get started if Cori doesn't mind talking through, and I have a customer org where I had to put in the sharing rules, so you can check them for me. Yes, I am recording, Kelly, and I'll make sure that the I usually post the recordings into the Hub Office Hours group, but I'll link to the Volunteers for Salesforce app group as well. So I'm in custom settings at the moment. Is that a good place to start, Cori?
Well, let's actually start on sharing settings, because then we'll see sort of the root of it all, the Salesforce aspect of it. So when you go to sharing settings and you just scroll down, you're going to past all your org-wide defaults. You're going to see a new checkbox that wasn't there previously, and in your org here it should be checked already, right? But in the callers on the line, it probably is unchecked. This is the optional new setting that's going to lock down object access to the site guest user to private. It's optional even today. It was supposed to be auto ticked in all customer orgs as of the March 1st. But many of you may have read that they're actually not going to be doing that. So there was a little bit too much feedback going on within our ISV community, within our customer community, that they just weren't ready. So if we turned it all on for everyone, they would have a lot of challenges. So then they came out, I suppose, came out saying, okay, fine, we're going to turn it on, but then you can untick it until the summer release. Now that's actually been delayed a little further. So this is going to be ticked automatically for everyone at some date in April. And that's to allow for us to come out with a Salesforce core patch to fix a really prominent bug that's happening because of this new setting. Once they get the patch out, once that bug is fixed, it has to do with Visualforce email templates, then you'll be able to, that will be auto ticked for everyone, and then you'll be able to untick it should you wish until the summer release of Salesforce. Knowing that, we would still recommend that you take the plunge and that you tick the box in your sandbox, that you test it, that you try it in production, do all the different things you need to do with Volunteers for Salesforce to get it working again, test it, and see how it goes. The challenge comes in is if you're using a different third-party app and they're not prepared for the change. So just make sure you're aware of what apps you're using. Do they use a site, and stay in communication with them too.
I think Click and Pledge Event is one of them, isn't it? IATS Payments, if you use them, they use sites. There's a bunch of different
Patron Manager?
Patron Manager, but I think Patron Manager is already fixed. They, again, having had warning, I think they've already done their settings. Yes, if we have any Patron Manager users, I think you're good. But there are quite a few apps that use sites, isn't it? So it's well worth having a look in setup under sites and see who else is, see what other apps maybe have sites created.
Yeah. And you know what, before we move on, I'm just going to put it out there. It really doesn't look like that Salesforce has done a great job at communicating this. So if it makes anyone feel better, I think a lot of lessons have been learned about communication of big changes. So yeah.
Just
Okay,
before we move on from here, Ryan just said that he doesn't see this box. Would there be some? Do you know? Would there be some instances that don't?
Well, there shouldn't be.
No.
So Cori, hey,
It actually,
if it's not showing, you have to hit edit at the top of your org-wide defaults and then scroll down in edit mode and it'll appear there for you to check it.
Oh, so this one, Art, this edit up where it says here, yeah, is that the one?
Yeah.
You mean
Ryan?
Correct.
Go ahead. Ryan, go ahead and try that and just tell us live here if that works. We've been seeing that as it come up in the hub. I was under the impression that they just couldn't click the box, like it was gray, but that makes a lot more sense why it was so confusing to folks. But yes, so that it should be there, and hopefully Ryan will see it when he does that. Otherwise, we'll have to help you offline, Ryan, maybe, or figure that out.
No, that's a good tip. Thank you.
Yeah, we updated the instructions too. Oh, weird. Okay, and you're in your production org, Ryan? Because it came out, this new field came out in the winter release in the fall. Okay, Ryan, why don't you ping me on the hub afterwards, and we'll help you look into that. You're not in Weird Sandbox or something, hey? You're in production. So I'm just wondering, Art, there's no actual critical update they have to sign in before they'll see that field, is there? I don't think so.
The critical update just checks it.
Yeah.
As well, but you can go through this method and it usually shows like what's on Caroline's screen right now where it has that box on the right.
Okay. Well, Ryan and Mary Lane, why don't you ping me in the hub and we'll get you sorted there. Weird. Okay, so moving on though. So what would happen is you would tick that box, and now instantly your objects are private from the site guest user. So you don't want to do this in production without testing in Sandbox and making sure you understand the steps first and how to communicate that to the Volunteers for Salesforce package to make sure that it can talk to your org. Okay, so the next step is going to the custom settings for the Volunteers for Salesforce package, and also ticking that new field we added to allow the site guest user to update the objects. So when you go to custom settings, you're going to scroll down and you'll see a custom settings for volunteers, right? And then you want to click manage. If you happen to click the label, there's a manage button there you can click instead. So if you've recently configured your V4S, you might remember this screen. If not, you probably did it once and have forgotten all about it. But this is where you can control some of the main settings of V4S, like what fields are being used for your contact matches for online, how many future months are showing for recurring jobs, etc., and a few other things. And you'll now see this as of version, oh shoot, I forgot the version number, but it's like 3.1.1.4 or something like that, that we released last September. With the grant guest user update access. So that's sort of saying, yes, sharing settings, new feature, we acknowledge you, and we're now adding additional support so that our package can update the records as needed. 3.1.1.4. Okay, I got that in here. Good, thanks, Art. So you're gonna, when you are going through this in your org, ideally your Sandbox first, you'll tick that box. The next step is to configure sharing rules. So you want to actually grant the site guest user profile access to the objects that come with Salesforce, Volunteers for Salesforce, as well as some of the custom objects that it uses. So in the search bar, what you would want to do is search for sites. And remember, a site guest user profile doesn't exist in your normal profiles list. It's a special user profile that can only be found within sites. Right, so go ahead and click on sites. And then scroll down, and you should see a site labeled volunteers or something similar that you're using for volunteers. Quick note, if you're here and you see other active sites, maybe with the label of a different product that you're using, for example, if you do see one called IS Payments or Brickwork, or even one for Click and Pledge, you'll know then that that app is using a site, and you'll want to make sure you're in communication with them about any changes that you'll need to make for them as well. So go ahead and click on the site label volunteers. And then from here, you can get to the site guest user profile by clicking on public access settings. Not at all straightforward or easy to understand.
But I've done it a few times before, so I know where I'm going.
Absolutely. Okay, so now it looks like a regular profile that you're editing. So keep in mind that yours might not look exactly like this, because there is something in the user management settings called enhanced profile or user setup profile. So it might look a little bit different, but both have access to the same information. So now we want to be configuring the sharing rules. So we want to go down to, now I'm so used to looking at the other one now, but it should be in the, where is it, the sharing settings? Or
It's so it's interesting.
Oh,
I mean,
I'm so sorry. I've led you down the wrong path.
Well, it's fine. I was following along. I mean, while we're here, actually, let's just talk.
Right.
We could just talk quickly about fields and things like that for anyone who's a bit newer to volunteers, won't we? But then we do have to go back. Yeah, I think we have to go back to the sharing rules, don't we? So
sorry.
That's all right.
Sharing rules are in sharing settings, but the first thing that we're doing when we're troubleshooting one of these, and the first thing we're talking customers through normally, is making sure that Volunteers for Salesforce has access to all the objects and all the fields on the objects, so that you're not getting some of those auth required errors that you can see online sometimes. That auth required error can be shown if you don't have your sharing rules configured properly, but also if you don't have the right access to objects and fields. So when you go to the site guest user and you click on object settings and you scroll down, you have a giant list of all of your objects. And you can see the standard ones, contact, campaign, etc. But if you scroll down to the bottom, you'll also see all of the volunteer objects. And we've got some very specific instructions in the link that I gave for the data sharing. Volunteer hours, for example, you need at minimum read and create, but the other objects that say volunteers on them that belong to the Volunteers for Salesforce package anyway, you just need a minimum of read. And then we have some other settings for the particular fields. Essentially, you need to grant the site guest user access to all the fields that come with volunteers, and then any custom fields that you may be using on your sign up page, on your personal sites pages, and anything really that you're trying to get your volunteer to interact with when you're using the online components that come with V4S.
And don't worry that this one says no access to volunteer recurrence. This organization doesn't use the volunteer recurrence schedules, but if you did, you would need to give access to them. I noticed that.
And that's not.
Go on. Sorry.
And that's part of the inside UI for the user anyway, not something that the site needs to really talk to.
That's true.
Just a side note too, you'll want to make sure that the site guest user does have access to the first name, last name, email fields on the contact for the matching. Okay, so let's now go over to the right place, to the sharing settings, and we can go back to creating those sharing rules. Okay, so when you scroll past, oh, sorry, back at the top, if you don't mind, Caroline. So a very important first question you need to understand is, how are your contacts org-wide defaults access controlled? is your contact set to public read write, which means it acts as an independent object from the account? Or is it set to controlled by parent, like in this case, which means any of the sharing rules or org-wide default settings that are applied to the account also apply to the contact? And that's an important consideration in determining what kind of sharing rule you need to create and what kind of fields you're going to use within that sharing rule.
And
so we know we need to create.
And control by parent, I think, is more normal for MPSP users, isn't it?
That's a good question. I actually don't know. I don't know. I will just accept that.
I think that's the one you would. I think that's the one you'd more normally see if you're an MPSP user, I believe.
Okay, I would have to check the trial. Maybe it's set that way in the trial.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah.
Art says he thinks that's the default setting. So yes, you may have changed it, but yeah, exactly. But sorry to interrupt, but you're right.
Absolutely. Okay, so when you scroll down past the org-wide defaults, we're going to see the actual sharing rules per object. And now what we know, and because we've read the instructions, always read the instructions, is we have to create an account sharing rule in order to allow the volunteer online components to be able to see contact records and this data and pull contact data into the personal site and find matching. We also are going to need to create a campaign sharing rule because the campaign object sits on the very tip top of our volunteer jobs. And so that's how you can give it access to the volunteer jobs. So if we scroll up slightly there and look at the, well, we're on campaign, we can just do campaign. So for the campaign sharing rule, we've put some suggestions in the guide. Now, Art and Katie and I talked quite a bit about this element of our guide because we want to give you information on how we would recommend you create your sharing rules. But it's difficult because every org is slightly different. The campaign is an easier one for us to tell you. Just make sure that on the campaign, the active equals true. That's the minimum that we've stated you could use. But Caroline has gone ahead and actually locked it a little further, which is great, and said also the campaign record type needs to equal volunteer campaign. That's a great addition. What that's doing is it's preventing volunteers from being able to talk to campaigns that have to do with your capital campaign or a fundraiser or something that you're doing. Because really, at the end of the day, you shouldn't grant access. You should grant access sort of at the lowest level that you can get away with and have it still work. So that's great. Then at the bottom, you'll notice that see the share with where it says volunteer site guest user. That's critical. So you want to make sure that when you're creating your sharing rule that you're sharing it with the right site, especially if you use more than one. So you want to share it with the volunteer site guest user, and then you're going to share it read only. When you're clicking new sharing rule, there's a couple of other little radial buttons that you need to select in order to have it look like this when it's saved. And we've detailed that out in the guide. So you can go ahead and, yeah, we'll show you. There's a little radial button there under step 2, which is select your rule type. It's going to default to based on record owner, but part of the new Salesforce core changes are that third one there, yeah, guest user access based on criteria. So you have to create a sharing rule specifically to grant access to a site guest user now. And then you would fill out the other fields and it would look just like it did when it was saved. Got the criteria, share with, and then the read only. Perfect. And Art's put in a note, just best practices depend on how your org is set up. Controlled by parent is recommended, but if you need to manage the account access separate from contacts for your internal users, then it's going to be a little bit different in your org. And to be honest, many of you may have seen the chatter going on in the hub, and we're asking people to create cases and stuff like that. There have been some bugs, but primarily what we're seeing is lack of access due to sharing rule setup. They're creating a sharing rule, but then the records they're trying to talk to don't meet that criteria they've selected. So in this case, you're trying to see shifts, but the campaign is inactive, something like that. Melissa, if you don't see the guest user access in sharing settings, like the tick box, see, that's super weird. Okay, we're gonna have to look into this. I have no idea why some of you aren't seeing that, but we'll figure it out. We always do.
Yeah.
All right, let's take a look at the account one. So the account one is
you
probably
wish it would just stay where it was on the page rather than scrolling you back up to the top. Hey.
No idea. Yes.
Yes. Do you want to see the existing one first or a new one?
Yeah, let's take a look at what you've built so we can see your criteria you selected, and then because it should really be the same as the campaign one with that third little radial button. So this is completely up to how you structure your org. And again, this is the one that's kind of been tripping up the most people. So account is actually easier to build a little bit than the contact one. So what you want to think about is your account model structure and your volunteer contacts and any other contacts that you might have that might potentially become volunteers in the future. For example, if you have a contact record type specifically for volunteers, great. You're going to want to make sure that the site guest user can talk to that record type so that, you know, they can display personal sites, they can sign up for shifts, etc. But if you have an existing contact that wants to become a new volunteer and wants to use the volunteer sign up page, then the site guest user needs to talk to maybe your donor contact record type if you've got it structured that way. You see the distinction? So you would, in that case, have to say my contact sharing rule can see both record types. The account sharing rule gets a little bit easier. So if both of those contact record types still roll up to an account record type for household, then you can just grant access to the household record type. So Caroline, what have you got here past household account? So you look.
This is because we used to have this organization has been a Salesforce user for a long time. I don't know whether you can actually see that there is a legacy record type that predates the household account, and I mean it's really not necessary because I don't think there are actually any households left in that old record type. But you know there was no harm in putting that one in as well. But basically, this is anything that might be a household. It's what I'm specifically excluding is organizations.
Okay, sounds good. We couldn't see the pop-up, but I'm assuming it's just another record type for an older record type.
Yeah, there's like household account and household legacy or household.
I see. Okay. Got it. Let's pause real quick here because we've got some chatter talking about why some people can't see that tick box. And Ken made a great suggestion of, does it not show up if there are no sites in the org? So if you, if y'all could confirm in the orgs you're looking at, have you created your initial site and deployed it? Because I think that's, well, maybe it has to do with the My Domain, but if you've never created yourself a site, then yeah, perhaps that can be why. Okay, we'll look into that after. Okay, back to the sharing settings. Oh, enable external sharing model. Yes, that is a step in the instructions. I'm gonna find it because on the sharing rules. We might as well try and solve this now. Hey, Caroline, I don't want to derail.
But that's interesting because it's not enabled here, but I had no problem seeing everything.
So I do remember one of the instructions saying to click enable if it's not already been clicked, and if it is clicked, you won't see that anymore. But to your point, you haven't enabled it, but you do have a site.
Well, maybe I did click it. And yes, I do have a site written, absolutely. And it's interesting because that was there. But then on the other hand, there's a bunch of external access shown here. So maybe this button is just here anyway.
Yeah.
And it's still here, even though I did enable it.
Right.
I do remember I did have to change something. So, it's one of those things. I was following along the instructions and going, I do remember having to do something, but I can't now remember specifically what it was.
Okay. Well, this is a weird little mystery I didn't expect today, but yeah, we'll do some testing on there, and then I'll drill in with the team maybe a little bit after the call, and we'll see what we can find. Because Ken is saying he doesn't have a site, but he does see it. If Ken, maybe you want to chime in if that's what you're seeing.
So what I just noticed was I do not have the enable external access. So that's not enabled. I don't have sites, but I see the radio button in my dev org.
You're in a dev org.
Yeah, there's something else. Like you said, I haven't solved the mystery yet. Sorry.
Oh, that's okay. You're in a dev org. So Mel is or Melissa is yours in production. Is it a production org, or you in some fancy dev org? See, okay. I'm wondering if the dev org is acting maybe a little bit differently. Yeah. Raise your hand or chime in if you have a production org where you're seeing the missing setting. Because that would be weirder. I could see something funky going on in a dev org, but so in dev org, not enabled, no sites. Production org, missing setting, but no sites. Ryan, okay. Ryan, you're gonna have to create a site then and tell us if that works.
Yeah, because I think, yes, because DevOrgs, there is a limit, to how many sites, or if you can create sites at all. I think there are limits in a DevOrg, which wouldn't be, yeah. Oh, wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
You're getting an insight into the customer-centric engineering brain or support brain, where you all will come up with all kinds of problems in the hub, but if we can't recreate it in an org, then we got to go to step 2, which is looking inside your org, right? So all these little things, there's got to be some common denominator.
Sorry, yes, we're really making you work customer service. I'm sorry about that.
Not at all. I love it. You know me. I do. I've what did someone tell me one time? I'm so chipper in the hub. Stop being so chipper in the hub as a joke. Because I truly do love helping everyone, and I use a lot of exclamation points, I think. Okay.
Okay. My favorite dev quote, I can't reproduce that error. Yeah. Okay. Thanks, Melissa.
Please provide clear steps to repeat and screenshots. That's my favorite one. Okay, so now technically, if you've done those 3 things, you should be good to go, right? You've enabled the Salesforce core setting, you've enabled the volunteers custom settings setting, and now you've created your sharing rules. Everything should be perfect. And for the majority of the 300 people that have already done it, they're good. The challenge, again, like I said, is sometimes getting those sharing rule criteria correct. And you really need to understand your contact record types and how your contacts need to be configured, making sure that you share it with the volunteer site guest user. We've seen that a couple times. And then the campaign, and your campaigns need to be active, and that your records actually meet the criteria. So if your shift and job isn't showing up online, is your campaign active? That's something that gets missed a lot. So the next thing that we would highly recommend that you do is test. So we've heard from some folks in the hub. I turned all this on last week. Now, today I'm getting calls from my volunteers. Well, nothing probably changed in the last 4 days since you did it, other than maybe you didn't test everything on the site. With the exception of Spring, there's some weird Spring bugs that are happening, but you want to test it. So there's an actual section in the guide all about testing. So let me just put that in here too. And it really just involves taking your site URL, putting it in a browser, and then appending the different default pages and bringing them up and just making sure that you can see everything. And that's what we've been doing for troubleshooting, actually. So it's been something that's come in really handy. We'll have people report a problem on one page, and I can see it. but then I'll check the other pages, and there will be issues on those other pages too, that perhaps the customer didn't even know existed. So if you go through this article, you'll see that there are, if you choose between, oh, sorry, maybe that was the wrong one. Customize test. Yeah. No. Oh, sorry. There's a different test in here. I am struggling slightly with the new table of contents. It was sometimes easier to just Control F in the PDF, but I'll find it here. Just takes an extra. There they go.
And this is because
Okay.
I was, after I'd done these sharing settings, I realized I had this in my history. So actually I have a calendar rather than a job listing. But yeah, this is the URL for the organization that we've just been looking at. And this is the URL that you take and then put into an iframe to put into your website. But I've been using the URL just to test.
Exactly. And you can sort of, test this before you do anything like that if you want to, or just go to your live site. But you can, so you would just take your URL and then append the slash, and then the rest you can copy right from the guide. This is the job calendar. There's one for job listing. There's one for the volunteer sign up, the personal site lookup, which is a really good one to test, because then you'll know for sure if your sharing rules are set up properly on account contact. And then you can even mock up the personal site page if you use the ID and email address from one of your contacts. You can also look up your own test contact or personal contact, and then just click the link that comes in the email, but you can kind of preload it as well, and test different kinds of contacts in your org. And then Mel's confirming, just to confirm, if you create a site, you get the guest user access based on criteria radio button, even in DevOrg. Oh, that's good to know. So that's the one to tick when you're creating a sharing rule. So then once you've tested, you should be good to go, and life can move on past the site guest user.
I have to say, yeah. I mean, this was with this organization. They'd come to me. They were getting the error that there are no jobs to show, even though they had just created all of these. And I started with the whole thing of, I'll look at the default months and everything else. But when I went into Salesforce, I could see that all these shifts had been created and they all seemed to be fine. And that's when I realized that I had to do all of this, set up these sharing rules and everything else. So once the campaign sharing rule was in place and I'd checked the boxes like you were saying, then suddenly magically everything appeared back on the calendar.
So when this is the most important one to test, I think, and it's the first one I look at because it should look like this, but there's actually two issues really that you could see. One is there's no shifts at all. It's completely blank and there's no jobs to show. That is going to be something to do with your sharing rules, or the job records themselves, the campaign record, the shift records, etc. If they're not made visible, then it's going to be empty here. But there's this nasty little bug within Core. They did put out a patch. It is resolved. That caused the problem. However, we have to fix the bug using internal tools in the org if you're getting it. So if you're getting it, you're going to see a big red arrow along the top, just above the arrows, and it's going to say list assignment. Oh geez, this is a hard one to remember. List assignment.
List assignment S object or something. Yeah.
Yeah, let me get the actual words. No matter how many times I try to remember this one, it keeps escaping me. It is list has no rows for assignment to S object. Complete gobbledygook unless you're a developer or someone working at Core. Or at least I don't know what it means. But it'll appear right up at the top. And essentially what it's doing is the site guest user, there was a bug in core where if the site guest user was trying to look inside the org and see itself, so its own user's information, there was a bug preventing that from happening. And you might think, well, what does that have to do with volunteers? But the volunteers app constantly looks at its own details on its own user record for the time zone, because the time zone is per user, and the site guest user profile needs to check the time zone to show what time to display these records to you in the shifts, when the job starts, etc. So it was trying to look at its own time zone and it failed, and then it caused a bug. And there was a brief workaround there where if you reset the user org-wide defaults and say like changed it to something else, saved it, changed it back to whatever they were, saved it, it would resolve it. But Salesforce came out with a patch to fix it. And then what it did was it made that user sort of mock fix, the little workaround, stop working. And the only way to resolve that error is for our support teams to run some nifty tools on the back end that'll clean up some of the inherent database tables that live in the Salesforce core Oracle world on the back end. So it kind of, if you think about it, kind of corrupted something in one of the spaces in one of the tables in the back end, and we have to run a tool to fix it. It's unfortunate because it can't be resolved without a case. So if you do see that error, create a case. You can ping me in the hub. I can escalate it to our team, and then we will resolve it. We can resolve it really quickly once we know that it's happening to you, but there's no way for you to resolve it on your own.
Oh,
yeah.
I liked your little workaround. It was great.
Yeah, for a day or two.
Yeah. Okay.
Fixed it. We're still looking into kind of like the root of that and why we have to run these tools to resolve it. So yes, Art, it wasn't getting any results. So it's running a SQL query on the back end that says, show me all the records. So it would look for the time zone, and then it would run a query to look for the results, and the results should show 1, but it was coming back with 0 because it wasn't able to see it. And then that is what the error is actually telling you, like, hey, we ran a SQL query and we can't find anything, so there's zero assignments in this list for the S object.
Okay.
Yeah.
But thank you also for the reminder, Ash, about the importance of the time zone. And there's a whole section in the instructions, isn't there, about, because there are several places that you need to check where the time zone settings.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So if you see that, tag me in the hub, post what you're having, create a case, give me the number, and we'll fix it for you. If you're getting that on the calendar, you may also see an authorization required error on like the job listings page or some of the other pages. It's a bit tricky because that particular authorization required error will also show up if you just haven't got your org-wide defaults right, your sharing settings right, your field access and your object access. So it can be a little tricky to troubleshoot, but we've gotten to the bottom of all of them so far. It's just taking a bit of time.
Cool. Okay. Trish, we've been allowing you to be really quiet for a little bit,
yeah.
But since you're here, just to kind of change the tack a bit, is there anything particularly about, I know you've used the Volunteers app a lot, so are there any tips or tricks you'd like to share with everyone while we're here?
Well, the only thing that occurs to me is the importance of understanding the whole sort of parent campaign and then jobs and then shifts business, because I think that is that's a structure that is not found anywhere else exactly in Salesforce, and so people just get confused about whether what kind of campaign they can create a volunteer campaign, but then they don't understand that they have to go down and do those steps. So I mean, I'm talking at a really basic level here, but, you know, volunteer jobs and then volunteer shifts, and then trying to figure out where you're going to put the hours. That's another thing that people have difficulty with. Like, you want to say that a volunteer actually contributed hours, but where do you add the hours in? So I usually have to take people through that and show them where they can actually put the hours. And I was actually a little bit concerned today because I was reading up on this big change that was coming. And is there an implication for the mass add volunteers and volunteer hours for this new change that's coming? Because it's on a Visualforce page.
And no, you shouldn't have any issues there. We are seeing some issues with using the find volunteers and volunteer roster buttons off of the shift and the hours, not the job, but not the campaign, but the job and the shift, which is related to a separate core bug about these settings and the Visualforce, but it's not affecting everyone. And it's not affecting every user on the same profile. It's not affecting every user using the same browser or different browsers. It's sort of this random user cached lightning problem because it works properly in Classic. So no, you shouldn't see anything. If you're getting a page not found error when you click those buttons, then tell me. We're actually collecting cases to file against a core bug for that problem. But a workaround is just switch to Classic, do the work you need to do, and come back, or try a different browser. Chrome seems to have the most issues, and it's not due to the same site changes. We already looked into that. Those were omitted from Salesforce. We got them to extend an extension so that they didn't apply those changes to our products.
Okay.
Is my understanding. So
okay, so Caroline, those are the it's the whole kind of like structure. Once you got it set up, then you really have to know about how the different objects actually sort of fit into the campaign structure, so that once you're doing it, you know, and you've got it figured out, then Volunteers for Salesforce is a piece of cake. But it's not that easy. Sort of, do I have to have a shift? No, you don't have to have a shift. You can still have hours if you don't have a shift. But then wait, how does that work? You know, it's those are the kinds of questions. I don't know. I don't see anything in the chat, so I guess everybody's not having that problem.
But did it? Well, go on. Sorry.
I was just going to agree. I think I work with Salam to Family Project. Trish and I both do, but you know, Abby, the admin there, has struggled with, well, I don't really need a shift. You know, why do I need a shift? I just have a job and they go away for 2 weeks. You know, there's different ways to use it. You don't have to use it in the prescribed way. And I'll just put a little plug in. This is an open source product. It always will be. And we're doing a sprint in Atlanta next month. We're coming to Seattle. Yes. Yeah, we're coming to Atlanta. Atlanta in March, Seattle in August, and Austin in December. And I think a really cool project could be, we have your docs, we have your user guide, we have your setup guide, but let's maybe have a practical guide. Maybe there's a doc that needs to be written to say, well, this is my world. This is how I handle volunteers. And I don't need hours. What do I do? What does that look like for me? So maybe there's an opportunity there to create another set of resources.
I kind of think everyone needs hours, and it's interesting. We'll have to dig out some of the stuff from Portland because we started a little bit of this. I think what's really interesting is how people do use jobs and shifts. For quite different times, particularly jobs, because it's an interesting way. It's really, I'm sure that, you know, when the app was designed, it was very much that the job was going to be the task, the thing that the volunteer did. but and then the shift is about the date and the time. But it's interesting. I've seen a job be a venue for a film festival, because they actually had different people needing to be at different times in different, for different screens for the film festival. So the best way for them to group it was that the job would be a venue. A different screen. I know that I think one of the things that we worked with in Portland was people sometimes use these for things like walking tours. I've also seen people use them for auditions. There can be a very interesting sort of where you blur the lines of kind of what's a job and what's a shift. I mean, I think shift always works really well for date and time, but what you do with the job can be quite interesting.
Well, I once created an entire on-the-job training program using volunteers for Salesforce, and so the courses were the jobs, and the shifts were the class meetings, and then I went through and tried to change everything that said volunteer into on the job, and it's almost possible. It's not 100% possible. I don't know whether there'll be any change. I mean, this was a couple of years ago, so maybe there's changes that won't make it possible now. But I had to go into the translation workbench to do it. But it was almost there. I mean, there was just like one or two places where there was no way to change it. But the whole classroom school. This was before the school management, HEDA, EDA, any of that sort of stuff ever. It was probably a dream in somebody's nightmare, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure. I don't. And of course, you can't do HEDA and NPSP at the same time. You can't add them both together. They're like oil and water. They don't mix. So this is still an option for people that want to track classes and sessions and conferences. I've seen people use it for conferences. So yeah.
So we've got with actually very little time, but we may be able to at least start, Nadine, in the right direction. Now all the interesting
Brian,
questions are coming in.
Volunteers can be used for non-paid events. Yes.
Absolutely, because yes, indeed, once you have this structure, Bryn, you can use the translation workbench and basically use the structure, but take away the word volunteers, as Trish had tried. There was this quick question from Nadine, or the question from Nadine about emailing for specific shifts. She wants shift reminders that go to a specific shift. So yes, you can do the timing, can't you? I mean, you might need, if it's just going to be a particular type of shift, might need some criteria somewhere in the in one of the rules, email rules, I think. Anybody got any ideas off the top of their heads about limiting which can have reminders?
That is not something I've tried to do.
Since we're kind of, we've come to the end of the session, I'm mindful of everybody's time. That's an interesting one, Dean, and I will set my mind to it as well, and we'll follow up in the hub for you. But yeah, that's an interesting question, that you just choose specific shifts, not all of them. See if we can think of a way around it. Okay, but yes, indeed, see and think about other ways that you might be able to use volunteers. But here's a quick one. Stephen just wants to know best process for reporting bugs. Art or Cori, what's
always the hub, because what's a bug in your org might not be a bug in the product. It might be just something to do with your org or your settings. So definitely post in the hub. Very clear steps to repeat, and images are great as long as it doesn't have personally identifying information in the images. Use a test record. If you asked in the hub already and didn't get an answer, then try reposting or clarifying. Sometimes the community don't jump in to help on a post if it's not really clear what's happening. So my recommendation would be to make sure your issue you're having is really clear. Once it's not resolved in the hub, then we monitor the hub. I get every single post. Maybe I shouldn't share this, but I get a notification for every single post.
Oh
no! I know, in multiple groups. So we will eventually see it. If you don't get any help, you can also just open a case, and either support will help you resolve it. And if it is a true bug or we can recreate it on our own, then we file an issue in GitHub. And then that alerts our developers to having to fix a bug. And then based on the priority or emergency status or severity of the bug, then it will get prioritized.
Great. That's an excellent note on which to end. Thank you very much indeed. So thank you, Cori. Thank you, Art, for also monitoring in the background. Thank you, Trish, for sharing your tips and tricks as well. Thank you to all of you who've attended and for your questions. We will be back with Hub Office Hours next Friday. We'll be back to doing a general Q&A. So thanks again for joining us, everybody, and have a wonderful weekend.
Thanks so much for doing this.